As a soulless virus spread, vulnerability and disparity bred. A nation that can lead the way, guided by head and gilded by heart. Alas, saw the divide ripped further apart. To rise above prejudice and give way to justice. To embrace every human with equity and dignity. It's time for true humanity. Our tomorrow calls out to us, invoking passion and purpose. And what each one of us does today can influence our way of living and rise as a nation of a billion thriving.
Good morning, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to the third day of the Dasra Philanthropy Week 2021. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us through the week and for the session particularly. The theme for this year's forum is A Billion Thriving, and DPW marks the beginning of this movement that each one of us must make our own. If there's one thought that we would like you to walk away with through our dialogues across the week, it is that we urgently need to shift conversations in philanthropy from surviving to thriving. And we can enable our most vulnerable to thrive only when each of us embrace justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, what we're calling a Jedi lens to all our work. Through the week, we really hope you engage with our live learning lab sessions such as these, as well as our daily philanthropy beat, and connect with each other to spark discussions that are idea focused, inspiring, and action oriented, and ultimately drive conversations that really matter. There has never been a more important time than now to come together and drive these important dialogues. So thank you once again for joining us at DPW 2021 and welcome to this session, Problem Boards or Board Problems, Leading Effective Nonprofit Boards in India. To start off with, as we were thinking about the session and what we might want to talk about, I started looking at how boards are composed, what their roles and purposes are, and what really came across is that a board is a very unique and curious leadership structure. It has significant power, but only as a collective. It sits both atop and outside of the organizational structure with a role that is accountable to those outside of the organization as well as those within. And
Paksan, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Just back up a couple of seconds, yeah.
Sure, sorry. So I think taking off from where we were and what we were talking about is basically the structure of a board and just reflecting on why it's such a unique structure or such a unique leadership structure. A board can be redesigned in any number of ways, but provided it has the collective will to do so. This is both the beauty and the challenge of a board structure. Only a board has the power to change itself, and boards can interpret and apply their own expectations of their roles and responsibilities. In most of the ways that matter, boards are their own accountability mechanism. This structure can work beautifully or fail miserably, and therefore, so can the organization associated with it, depending on how this very important group called the board is populated, managed, and leveraged. And so with that, I am going to introduce my absolutely fantastic panel that I have here very, very quickly. I'm not going to go into too many details because there's too much to say about all of them. But the five folks that we have over here, Ravi Venkatesan, Irina Vittal, Vivek Pandit, Aarti Madhusudan, and Peter Smitham, collectively, when I was looking at their bios, I think we have and not even exaggerating, 100 years of board experience among all of these folks. And while they have been on boards of non-profit, I hope that doesn't make you feel too old, Peter. But while they have been on many, many for-profit boards, why we have them here today is because of the role that they've played to grow non-profits in India and globally. And so, with that sort of introduction, I'm really looking forward to sort of learning from all of y'all, given your experiences on nonprofits ranging from education to adolescence, family planning, to health, um, um, and in different structures and in different roles. Very, very excited to have you all. Thank you so much for being here, especially Peter, at this unearthly hour in the UK. Really appreciate you joining us. And so, with that, I think we're going to dive right in. The one thing that we really want this discussion to be is sort of straightforward and honest. It's not often, and you know, we were discussing this in the prep session before. It's not often that we talk about nonprofit boards and the effectiveness of boards. I think in the sector we do speak a lot about, you know, capacity building of nonprofits and capacity building of nonprofit leaders. But how do we really strengthen the boards of nonprofits is not something that we delve usually into. And we want to use this opportunity and the next sort of 1.5 hours to have honest conversations around, you know, the role of the board, the evolving role of the board member, and the chairperson, and how can we all together sort of strengthen this leadership structure to be able to strengthen the sector ultimately. And so I'm going to start off and dive right in. Um, but before I do that, just to set the context for everyone, we are going to not have this as a panel discussion for the entire 1.5 hours. I'm going to go to each of the panelists with one question. So that will be around 30 to 40 minutes. But what we really want to be able to do is have a larger conversation because we have some fantastic folks who have signed on as audience from nonprofits as well as board members themselves. So we would really want to have a larger discussion. Please feel free to put in your questions in the chat. The team will be curating them at the end, and I will call upon you all to please ask those questions and have a discussion with this wonderful group of folks that we do have here. So with that, Ravi, I'm going to come to you directly with the first question. I'd like to reference a very insightful article, Ravi, that you wrote in the Mint in 2019, urging nonprofit boards to be more engaged. You said, and I quote, that nonprofit boards have become too passive and need to be engaged far more and be far more active to actually contribute to the organizations that they serve. It's very interesting that a year later, given the COVID crisis, boards find themselves exactly in that situation. Last year, we've seen board members engage far more with their NGO leadership. And so my question to you to start off with is, what made you say this a year back in 2019? And why do you think this is even more relevant today?
Hey, thank you, Paksan. Yeah, that article was actually more oriented towards corporate and for-profit boards, but everything applies, I think, conceptually to the nonprofit boards as well. Back then, I was reflecting on my experience on a number of boards and saying, look, most boards around the world that I've served on seem to be designed for a time and period in the world which no longer exists. They're designed for a period when things were stable and predictable. And so I call them peacetime boards. Okay. And, peacetime boards don't have to do much. They, in fact, shouldn't do much. They, worry about compliance, disclosures. They find the next CEO and manage the occasional crisis. They give a bit of advice when asked. But the problem is that the environment we're living in today, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit, is turbulent. It's uncertain. We saw that last year, and it's filled with disruption. And so there's a very, very high risk that peacetime boards get overwhelmed. And we've seen this to happen to the most eminent of boards around the world. We've seen this happen in India to, an ICICI bank. I was at Infosys and we got into trouble. Fortunately, we were able to come out of it. You look at GE and Boeing. It's the same story over and over again. And they're packed to the brim with extraordinary people, and yet it happens. So you need to rethink everything. First and foremost, you need to rethink who's on the kind of people who are on it. They're not necessarily the biggest names. Usually these boards pick safe pair of hands, people who won't rock the boat. What you need now are very different people who have expertise, passion, willing to roll up their sleeves, contribute, and most of all, who have, independence of spirit. Then I talked a lot about the fact that strategy and talent, which were in the past or traditionally in the realm of management, today you can't leave it there. It's so central to the organization and its success. You have to work together. The board and management have to work together on these issues. And most of all, I talked about the need for very different model of board leadership, the board chair. And I think today's environment, again, puts a real premium on a few qualities, attributes. One is judgment, wisdom. I call out courage, the ability to carry the board along and make incredibly difficult decisions which are necessary. And someone who's able to get the board to focus its talent, its expertise, its time, everything on the few issues that really matter. There's a real tendency or a temptation to cover a whole bunch of other issues. And I think effective chairs get the organization and the board really focused on what matters. And I think an exactly similar paradigm shift or revolution is needed in the not-for-profit world as well. So if you take a very simple question, why do you need a board? Most people say, well, because it's a requirement. Okay, it's a statutory requirement. And yeah, it ensures that we have good governance. And that's important if you're going to get funding and so forth. All this is true. But if that's all you expect from your board, I think you're really missing out on a whole lot, right? If you've got an effective board with good, committed people, it's your most valuable ally. So I'd like to think of boards performing at least three very different functions. One is, of course, governance, and I'll say that's hygiene. The second very important thing is thought partnership. Right now, if you're a not-for-profit, you're typically trying to either solve some complex problem or deliver some essential service. And there are all kinds of tricky questions. For instance, how do you measure impact? It's not as trivial as it is in the corporate world. You have real challenge there. How are you going to think about making impact? Your so-called theory of change. How are you going to scale things? How do you mobilize resources? Blah, blah, blah. And it's fantastic if you can have really experienced, thoughtful people helping you work through these kinds of questions. The third function, I think, is networks, access to networks. If you've got the right people on the board, they open up their networks. It's not just capital. And so they open up access to the private sector, to public sector, to funders and so forth. So when I've approached building boards for the organization I'm involved with, Social Venture Partners or GAME or the UNICEF GenU, I've actually decided it makes sense to have three different boards because the functions are so different. So you have a statutory board and they've got people who are financially competent and know the rules and they make sure you're out of trouble. But then you have a very different group of people who are helping you think about the strategic direction and impact and all that. We call that the advisory board. And they are not the same people. Okay. And then in some cases, like our UNICEF thing, we wanted really eminent people, heads of state and CEOs and all that, who would lend their reputation and networks. And so we created a third board, which is called the council of great people. We call it council of leaders, but it's great people. So I would suggest that it's actually worthwhile thinking about whether you need 1, 2, or 3 different groups performing these different functions. I think the second thing that I would say about our not-for-profit boards is you've really got to start by thinking about what expertise you need and what networks do you need to access, particularly in an environment like we're in today in India. And in addition to that, of course, what you really want to select for is people who are passionate about the mission and see this organization, this board, as a vehicle, a platform for the impact they wish to have. And the final and really important thing is small egos. It becomes incredibly dysfunctional when you have multiple big egos in a small organization. And so because this is not always easy to suss out in the beginning, this is one of the more reasons why I like the advisory board, because you invite people on there with some hope and optimism, but if it is not working out and neither side is having a lot of fun, there's a elegant exit ramp for some people of the advisory board. It's very hard to make changes on the statutory board. So I would say that's kind of important. The really core issue is, how do you actually get the most out of the people you have? How do you get the most out of your board? How do you engage? Personally, I have a huge bias to serve on boards that work, and I try to build working boards, right? And so it's not just about the quarterly meeting where there's some financials and there's a presentation of activities carried out in the last quarter. That's kind of not particularly interesting. Question is, how can you spend the bulk of your time on the issues that really matter, which is what? Looking at impact, measuring it, how are you scaling it, what are the constraints, whether it's talent, whether it's resources, how do we unlock these constraints, what are the risks? Today we're living in such an incredibly high risk environment, so how are we mitigating those, etc. And in 2 of the organizations, Pakshan, we've gone much, much further, both in Game and Generation Unlimited, which are collaborative arrangements. We do our work through what are called task forces, which work on individual problems, like how do you enable access to finance? How do you get entrepreneurship curriculum going in schools? And each of them has a task force with diverse stakeholders. And our task force chairs are who are on our board. So they're not just out there showing up once in a while. They're intimately familiar with the working of the organization. They're driving important pieces of work. So you have, for instance, Geeta Goel of Michael Susandel Foundation. She drives our work on 21st century skills and entrepreneurship curriculum. You have a retired civil servant, Dr. K.P. Krishnan, and he's driving our ease of doing business work. Professor Anant Nageshwaran, he drives our measurement, evaluation, and research. And so this makes a huge difference because you've got people sitting at the table in a board discussion who are incredibly knowledgeable what's really happening in the organization and on the ground. And the board meetings, I don't believe in this quarterly cadence. Too much happens in a quarter. So I think once every other month, 4 hours, and everything that can be read is sent off as pre-reading and not visited. And you focus on what you can only do together. And the final point I want to talk about is the nature of board leadership. I just absolutely believe that CEO and chair roles should be separate. CEO runs the organization, chair leads the board. And the board chair really, in addition to all those qualities I talked about earlier, has to be incredibly passionate about the mission, make time, be willing to coach and support the CEO in every which way, and make sure the board is razor focused on just 2 things, impact and sustainability. So let me sort of wrap up. Look, we're living in virtually a perfect storm in the not-for-profit world in India. On one hand, funding is drying up, even as their needs are shooting up, so much more competition for scarce resources. On the other hand, at this point in time, the current political dispensation is not really a fan of the sector. So, we've got to be very, very alert to these 2 risks. And at this point, more than ever before, a great board is worth its weight in gold. So let me pause here.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Ravi, for opening up sort of various dimensions of what we would love to discuss, from types of boards to task forces to sort of the role of boards, the chairperson, the political scenario, and therefore the role of the board within that, and super important, all the softer aspects that sort of surround the functioning of a board, whether it's sort of big egos in a small organization, or how do we even think or plan for exits within boards, things that uh, are usually problems or issues or challenges that nonprofit leaders face but don't really know how to address them. So we'll get to all of that in this session today. So thank you very much for opening that up. Irina, I'm going to come to you next. And Ravi said something very interesting, right? He said that the board is here to be able to sort of provide thought partnership, access to networks, and really be an ally, to the organization. In your experience of, being on boards of, so many nonprofits, I think what I'd like for you to sort of share with us is really how do we see boards evolve, right? Because an organization evolves through its life cycle. And the kind of sort of thought partnership it might require, or the networks it might require, or the allies it might require, or the leadership it might require will vary based on perhaps the stage at it is at. And therefore, uh, you've often spoken about how boards need to evolve with the organization. So would love for you to sort of give us an understanding of, how boards can evolve in their composition, in their structure, in their role, in their purpose, to really be that ally for the organization at that point in time.
Thanks. Let me talk about three things. When do you need a board? How do you think about the composition of a board? And how do you work with it? The mindset that you have to work with a board. Let me start with the first, which is when do you need a board? I think it's critical if you run a nonprofit to not get a board too early. And here's how I think about it. I think CEOs or founders play three very different roles in the life cycle of their organization. Initially, they are the engines. They do everything, the idea is in their head, they hire people, they go to the field, they know everything that's happening. Their energy is the energy of the organization. At this point in time, you don't need a board. At this point in time, you need a believer who is with you because you're kind of making it up. You don't know if it will work, and you don't want too much of discussion and too much of distraction. Phase two is you become the person who repairs the engine. You've hired a few people, you still have line of sight of the organization, you know everything that's happening, the memory of the organization is in your head, you're grooming people. At this point in time, perhaps you need friends and family, one funder, one supporter who is guiding you and saying, hey, this will work. You don't need too much of distraction. But there comes a phase three when you're not the engine, you're not the engine repair person, you're the engine designer. You're now thinking about how to scale up. People are being hired that you haven't met. Funders are asking for impact. Government is waking up and saying, hey, who's this entity, good, bad, or ugly? And a lot of questions are starting to arise in your head. Choices are becoming critical. And more importantly, occasionally you find that there's a drag. Stuff that you used to do very easily in an organization is now suddenly looking difficult. Mistakes that you made are being made again. At this point in time, you need a third party who holds up the mirror and supports you. So when you become the designer of an engine is when you should look for a formal board. Don't do it too early. So that's point number one. Point number two is how do you now put together this board? Remember, the board is there to serve your cause, not you, but your cause. And therefore, it should reflect skills that are complementary to you. And it obviously depends a lot on the context, but usually I find three skills are useful and one skill is not necessarily useful. The first skill that's useful is survival. Somebody wanted me to join their advisory board and I was not sure I had any domain expertise. And the person told me something so interesting. He said, I want you to save the organization from my biases. So survival is about risk, it's about governance, it's about de-biasing an organization from your instinct. This is what boards do. Second is scale up. Scale up comes from the operating model how do you run operation? It comes from hiring. How do you hire people who fit? And increasingly, it comes from a technology roadmap. How do you think about people on the board who can help you think through a technology roadmap? So scale up is the second skill. And the third skill is access. The access can be to funders, the access can be to regulators, it could be to government people, it could be to large organizations, it could be to fellow nonprofit people. So to me, these are usually the three sets of skills you're looking for when you're putting a board together, which is de-risk, ensure survival, help scale up, get access. And of course, you want a board that kind of works with each other. The point that Ravi made about muted egos and some amount of chemistry that works. What is not necessary is to put funders on boards, because funders come for the cause. They come because they bet on you, and you can have a circle of funders. I mean, it's a choice. Some people do have funders on boards, but it's not necessarily to reward a funder by giving him social recognition by putting him on your board. Create a friend circle or a funder circle or whatever, right? So, but think of the board as something that you're putting together to be of help to you, not necessarily to only do oversight. Because at the end of the day, if you don't scale up, the world would have missed out on somebody who's doing a lot of good. So think of the composition of the board from a skill and a chemistry point of view, and then evolve it, because every 6 months, 12 months, you might bring in a new person and onboard them. And then my last point, which is what's the mindset as you think of a board? I think it's very critical to remember that boards, because they are there to help you succeed in your cause, the first mindset is board members should be constructive. At the end of the day, the management and the founder is doing tough stuff, whether it's a corporate board or a nonprofit board. And at best, a board is outside and occasionally looking in. And so one has to have the humility to know that we're kind of winging it most of the time. And therefore, when you're making a suggestion, it's at best a constructive suggestion. And therefore, the second thing is it has to be contextual. Board members who say, in that nonprofit, this happens, is useful, but does it work in my context? Which means the person should have spent time understanding you. He or she should ideally visit the field at least once a year. He should know your top team, because so much of amplification of impact comes from the top team. And if you don't understand the top team, you don't understand the capacity of an organization. So board members should be contextual, and board members should be non-judgmental, because shit happens, right? And you only know this in retrospect. And if an organization is not goofing up, then it's not taking enough of a risk. So being supportive and taking everything as a learning moment is important. What board members are not supposed to be, they're not supposed to be decision makers. They're not supposed to be judges, and they're not supposed to be directive, saying, hey, this is what you need to do. So I think it's very critical that if you want a board to be effective, you need to know what you want out of a board, and you need to draw respectful boundary conditions beyond which, if the board is not playing ball, you find gentle ways of nudging your chairman to give feedback to the board member, or in the worst case, say goodbye with a lot of love and respect. So I think boards are there to serve you. Be very careful that you don't get them too early. Be thoughtful about the skill and the chemistry mix, and then be open to feedback and to insights, but pick and choose what you want, except in areas where you think you know it all, because those are the areas where you goof. And that is the area where you should listen to the board more than anywhere else. Let me pause here and see if this makes sense.
That's fabulous, Irina. Thank you so much for that. And I think one of the main things that you said is, does this work in my context, right? I mean, we often hear of boards sort of sometimes being decision makers, sometimes being overly suggestive. You spoke about sort of learning moments. You spoke about boards being non-judgmental. And then you spoke about sort of skill and chemistry. So that's a whole lot that you've given us in terms of what boards should be and shouldn't be. And which brings me now to you, Peter. And with Irina's suggestion, I'm going to softly nudge you, since you've been a chairperson of Atlantic Philanthropies for nearly a decade, and you were a board member of many, many sort of organizations um, during sort of your 20-year experience of being on nonprofit boards. Uh, could you just take us through the experience, Peter, of being the chairperson and being that sort of a go-between, if I might say, between this group of board members that you have, and that you've got to make them do everything that Irina said, uh, and still be sort of supportive, non-judgmental towards the organization, be able to coach the management and the leadership, that you're working with, so that ultimately, that board is worth its weight in gold, as Ravi puts it. So, how does a chairperson ensure that the board is worth its weight in gold?
Can you hear me okay, Paksan?
Absolutely.
I think it depends so much on the situation that the board is in. So if you take two board roles, you mentioned Atlantic Philanthropies, which I'll talk about, but I'm also on the board of a company called NXP, which is one of the biggest semiconductor companies in the world. And the relationship of the two positions is very, very different. So I must admit, I find it very, very difficult to talk about the generalities. I think the expression that Irina used about being an engine designer is a really interesting way of capturing it, because then you've got a question, what is the engine for? Is it going to be for a plane, or is it going to be for a car, or for a motorbike? So I'd like to talk more about, if you like, the customization of the process. If you take an organization like Atlantic Philanthropies, it was formed by one man. And the man is a very, very unusual character. If anybody's read the book, The Billionaire That Wasn't, basically he gave away all his money. At that time was about 5 billion, and he kept 3 million. He believed in anonymity. He didn't believe in taking any credit for what he did. He doesn't need credit. He doesn't need acknowledgement. So it was going to be limited life. I hate that expression. Sounds like euthanasia. But having a spend down philosophy, I think makes a lot of sense. So when Chuck Feeney and I first met, he was saying things like, I want to be anonymous. I want the organization to be closed in a certain amount of time. I'd like us to focus on the vulnerable and the disadvantaged, and so on. So the brief, which was very much around a value system, very much around an ideology. An ideology isn't something you're going to prove, it's something that you actually believe in. And Chuck believed in all those things. But he couldn't picture how an organization would ramp up, which it did, and finished up making donations of about 10 billion, and then ramped down again. So he had practical concerns pre this judgment and this change of strategic direction. It had been very, very much a random organization. He'd sort of literally been giving money to whatever he felt was appropriate at that time. But he wanted a much more distinctive philosophy, but he wasn't quite sure what it was. So we went through a process where we talked about causes that Atlantic could focus on. So that was very much an investigative process. We talked very much about the geographies. Geographies brought back various experiences. So we were in Vietnam. Chuck was there during the war. We were in Australia because Australia could provide an infrastructure support for Vietnam. We were in the United States. We were in Ireland. We weren't in the UK. We were in America. So 50% was America, about 25% was the island of Ireland, and the rest was spread. So we had a geographical framework. We had a framework which was around the vulnerable and the disadvantaged. It was around activism. And because of the attitudes, it was very much about cost-effective, demonstrable, scalable. So there was a framework and a set of values. So then when we were talking about the board expanding, because it was quite a small group at that time, and Bridgespan had been involved quite a bit in the consultancy, people know Bridgespan, and Atlantic had been one of the first founders of Bridgespan. So it was very, very much geographically constrained. It was very much the vulnerable and the disadvantaged. So it was nothing about the opera. It was nothing about anything that wasn't a vulnerable and disadvantaged group. So we were focusing on people of color in the United States. We were focusing on issues like the abolition of capital punishment. We were talking about mixed Protestant Catholic schools in Ireland. So there was a whole host of quite wide social issues. An interesting project was actually sort of creating a movement around Obamacare. So really what I'm trying to say is, it's very, very much about the situation. You take the chair role in an organization like PSI, where I'm also on the board, Population Services International. It's totally different. And I think Ravi touched on that. So at PSI, I chair a group which is about fundraising. In Atlantic, the money was already there. It was a question about how did you invest the money to optimize the returns? How did you get to closure? So I think the board's got to be clear about what the value drivers are, which geographies are you in, what style of operation are you going to have? Very, very important. What do you intend to do yourself and what do you intend to use other organizations for? Partners, subcontractors, whatever word you want to use. But the focus should be around the distinctive competence that you need to apply to deliver what it is you've set out to do. So success is actually sort of planning systematically your outcome and then delivering that. And the way that you go about it is going to vary depending on the environments in which you work. Ravi made a great point. COVID has completely disrupted everything. An organization's ability to react proactively, productively to COVID is a huge challenge. So for me, it's very, very much situational. Chuck is an ideologue. Can you imagine anonymity? You won't go anywhere in the world and find Atlantic's name on anything. I'll tell you one sort of funny story. We put a very large grant into Roosevelt Island to support high-tech campus of Cornell University. Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, asked us whether we were going to put our name on the building. And Chuck Feeney said, well, why would I want to do that? And Bloomberg said, because you'll get recognition. And Chuck said, I don't want recognition. I'm really sort of quite happy as I am, thank you. And then someone else in the group said, Mr. Bloomberg, does it have value? And Bloomberg said, well, of course it does. And we said, then great, sell it, sell the naming rights. And someone came along and put up a lot of money to have their name put on that building. So when you're dealing with a person like Chuck Feeney, he really is a strong ideologue. He has very, very strong values, and he doesn't feel the need to justify them. It's a form of self-expression. Passion and energy is such a distinctive combination, focus and competence, and the organizational model that's appropriate to pull those four elements together. And you see it. I think I've been on 50 boards. The big number is in part because I worked in private equity, and the average duration has been 7 years. Atlantic has been 20 years. And what?
You're very old.
My wife said very encouragingly, but you've got the advantage of age.
We call that experience, Lynn. No, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Peter. That was fantastic in terms of, so basically you're saying that it's really contextualized to the purpose of the organization, to the purpose of the nonprofit leader, where they're in their life stage, where the organization might be, and therefore how does a chairperson sort of balance all of those conflicts of interest, but also with what that larger mission and picture might be. I'm going to come to you, Vivek, now, because Peter did speak about something in terms of purpose, right? I'm just going to stretch it a little bit in terms of how sort of literature has evolved or thought leadership around board engagement and what the role of boards need to be. And a very recent SSIR article spoke about purpose driven boards. Now, when I read that article, it did seem a little bit of a sort of, uh, uh, if not a utopian sort of context, it did seem quite aspirational in terms of where boards need to be. And if I may actually just be able to speak about a snippet of it, it says a traditional board asks what is best for our organization. A purpose driven board asks what is best for the desired social outcome we seek. I'll just repeat. A traditional board asks what is best for our organization. A purpose driven board asks what is best for the desired social outcome we seek. And Vivek, in our sort of conversations before, you have touched upon sort of board members and boards being purpose driven, given that nonprofits already are. So, if you could tell us a little bit more about, what do you mean by that, and how can, what does it mean to be a purpose driven board, and what does it mean, and what does it take to be a purpose driven board member?
Thank you. Thank you, Pakistan. And following several of the most excellent comments that have been made, I've been taking notes myself. So thank you for this, inviting me to this session. Let me start with the question of purpose, because it's sometimes it might come across as odd to talk about purpose for a nonprofit board, right? So let me reframe the question of purpose. Purpose elicits a certain level of what I'd call, almost outperformance. The ability to, it is at some level, it is the reason for which something exists or the reason for which something is done. It is it's the basis of a person's sense of resolve or determination. And the question is, how does this manifest for board members? We know it exists in the institution. We know it exists for the founder. We know it exists for the employees. The question is, when you're a nonprofit board member, how does purpose manifest itself in your role and in what you do, right? Because I think, as Ravi well said, this is not about compliance or about even strategy. It's actually about a level of engagement and a level of authenticity that Irina touched on. So, so for institutions that are already so purpose-driven, how does this manifest for board members? Now, we know that, for purpose-driven organizations, you'll find that employee engagement is 2.5 times higher. You'll find they are 2.8 times less likely to churn or leave the organization. You'll find that people are actually willing to work for anywhere from 15% to 50% less in terms of income to make those trade-offs. Right. So the question is, how does that translate to a board member? How does that translate to greater outcomes for the organization through its board? So, many people have described, the first thing I'd say is many people have described the role of boards, nonprofit boards, as either work, wealth, and wisdom, or time, treasure, and talent. And as one colleague put it to me, which is a little bit maybe controversial in the face of some of the comments that were made earlier, about 15 or 18 years ago, when I was stepping onto my first nonprofit board, they said to me, your job is to give, get, or get off. And make no mistake about it. Now, of course, this was a colleague that was working in North America, and I will say that there's a difference. There's a difference. Culturally, I've observed, I've been on boards, I've been on some global boards, I've been on North American boards, and I've been on some Indian nonprofit boards, and they do act a little differently. But what's different what is truly different for a purpose-driven board and in the nonprofit context? I think the first I would say is resources. A CEO office is not a team, a CEO office for a nonprofit is just a CEO. In some sense, no matter how large they are, everyone is consumed and scattered and torn for resources. There may be a few very well-funded nonprofits, but in the Indian context, by and large, I've seen, a few of us may have had the fortune of being part of boards that are very well endowed. I think most of us enter boards that aren't that well endowed. Most of us enter boards where the CEO is truly scrambling to make things happen, and they don't have an army of people at their disposal. So the first I would say is, these sometimes are kings without a kingdom, but a huge level of purpose. And one of the objectives, I believe, of a good board member in the Indian nonprofit context is to actually help create leverage, to provide forms of resourcing, as Ravi put it, to extend their network that goes well beyond just fundraising, but also engage other people who are able to provide a certain level of leverage and capacity to the CEO and the institution. So that's one. The second difference is expectations. On regular boards, no one asks you to go raise capital. On regular boards, no one asks you to go represent the company, in another forum. On regular boards, for the most part, they're drawing down on your wisdom inside the context of board meetings, not on your network, right? So I think the expectations are different. The expectations around being able to resource capital, right? There are expectations around representation. In many cases, I've been part of some boards where the reputation of the board far exceeds any currency I would bring. But I've also been part of many boards where my own reputation and currency exceeds that in some circles of that of the institution. And I think recognizing your role in the context of what you bring, relatively speaking, right? Relatively speaking, clearly the people of the great people Ravi referred to would bring value to just about any institution. But a number of us who find ourselves as professionals or people who may not be as well known outside of our own professional circles, certainly, have to think hard about what exactly do we bring, right? And I think board members have to ask themselves, what exactly can they do that is distinctive and truly value adding to the board, right? And the expectations, as Arena put it, should be set early, right? If a CEO says, I really do expect you to help me unbiased decision making, well, great. I think you can understand exactly what role you're going to play. But in many cases, those expectations aren't set appropriately because the initial board is set up through what I would call a degree of familiarity or filial relationships with the founder. And Ravi alluded to something very important, right? Again, part of expectations is off-ramping a board member who may have outlived their useful life can sometimes be much more difficult than onboarding one. And that is very necessary because, board members who may become complacent or may be listening and not engaging, or may not be, if quote unquote, as Aarti talks to me about, pulling their full weight, I think becomes, it sucks energy, to put it bluntly. It sucks energy, it sets a certain tone. So the second point is around expectations we have of one another and that the institution will have of us. The third is engagement. And I do want to say a word about engagement. I think what Peter described as part of the Atlantic is interesting because there's a certain level of anonymity associated with some philanthropists' work. I think in India, for better or for worse, internal engagement is important because it gives the CEO and the institution support. But I would say external engagement is maybe twice as important. And the reason for this is, like I said, your reputation and access will matter, right? Especially in the building phase, right? Your engagement will matter because, there are boards that tend to be very operational early, and then boards who are able to see the forest from the trees later. And your level of engagement when you're seeing forest from the trees isn't, it's not meant to be disengaged. It's meant to be actually highly engaged, right? And highly engaged boards that are able to fly at 30,000 feet and yet bring value require you to really understand the organization, understand its relationship to external stakeholders. And if you're really doing your job, there will be conversations you have with external stakeholders about the institution. I put a small rule in my own book, which is I should be having 2 to 3 times the number of conversations about this institution outside the institution that I'm having with other fellow board members of the founder. And if I am, I think that's a reasonable test of my engagement. So that's the third point around engagement. Maybe a quick point on composition, because I think composition does help elicit purpose. Broadly speaking, we've seen 5 types of board members, right? We've seen the activist who takes the mission on as vociferously and as passionately as a founder, but not all board members are activists. We've seen the volunteer who's ready to be asked for anything. Just tell me what to do, right? You have those board members. You have the donor, as Reena spoke, right? They are recognized for their donation or their personal ability to fundraise. You have the doer, sustainer. These are people who get into the weeds, sometimes try to, be a coach to the CEO and really drive, if you will, the mission to say, why don't we move into a country X? Why don't we think about extending our capabilities in these new areas? And then finally, you have the founder. I can't say there's any magic formula for the mix, but I think it is important to recognize, especially for founders and CEOs, to recognize what kind of board member they are and how they're most likely to be engaged. And instead of using a one-size-fits-all model for we'd like everyone to do these 5 things, thinking about where they can really bring distinctive value and where their energy is most naturally useful is both important in terms of selection, as much as it's important in terms of self-reflection as a board member. And frankly, sometimes as a board member, you're better off saying, I would love to make a huge difference here. And at some points in time, that's going to matter to the institution. At some points in time, it may not. And recognizing and having that dialogue openly is as important as trying to be sometimes all things to all people. Now that's, I think that sometimes that becomes a bit of a recipe for a problem, in part because most board members of nonprofits are either are very consumed with many other activities. And this is not their full, of course, it's not meant to be a full-time job, but it's not the only board they sit on, right? And so I think, picking your bets becomes important. The final thing I'd say is a bit tactical, which is you should think carefully about size. In India, small is below 6 and large is above 10. In the US, small is below 13 and large is above 22. It's quite different, right? Think about two-way accountability, right? The board to the CEO and the CEO to the board. What does that mean? And more often than not, the board accountability to the CEO sometimes is not as high as the CEOs would like. We get stuck in CEO accountability to the board. The third is role of the chairperson. I cannot understate the value of a good chairperson. I think the value of a good chairperson quite literally determines a board's success. I won't say more about that because a number of people here have chaired boards, but the way they set the agenda, the expectation they have of others, the role modeling they do about level of engagement they have matters a great deal. I think at the end of the day, many boards are stacked with individuals who see themselves as peers outside those boards and don't waste that. Nobody wants to be shown up in a board to be not contributing among a bunch of other board members who frankly regard them as peers in their external outside that institution's life. And the final point is I'd say, be more deliberate about inducting and retiring board members. I know some of us have, I deliberately retire myself from boards. I asked to get off. Oftentimes I'm asked not to leave, but the truth is that I know when my energy for a particular cause a particular board might be waning, and I sometimes recognize the need for new energy. So let me stop there, but thank you for inviting me to this. I'm going to keep taking tons of notes.
Thank you so much for that, Vivek. I mean, so many things sort of resonate from the nonprofit sort of angle. But I think one of the things that you said, which sort of stuck with me, is you know, the need for the board member to be highly engaged. Obviously, in any sort of board, but especially, on a non-profit board, given that there might be different contexts from which different board members might be coming in, might not necessarily understand the sector, might not necessarily understand the social context within which the organization is trying to make the change that it's trying to make. And so I'm now going to move and use that sort of link and move to you, Aarti. And you are the final sort of bastion we come to before we open it up to sort of audience questions, because I do see in the chat that there are a number of questions and we do want this to be conversational. But Aarti, I do want to flip the conversation before we open it up, right? So we've spoken a lot about the role of the board member, the absolutely important role of the chairperson in being able to navigate that board, navigate the leadership. But if I were to flip it a little bit, and given that you have such vast experience and a breadth of sort of witnessing so many boards, nonprofit boards in action in India, if I were to ask you, sort of, and where sort of would you, at a very general, just for us to get an understanding of where you might think today non-profit boards in India lie on a scale of 1 to 10, right? In terms just of effectiveness in what everyone else has said. But I mean, that's just to give us a sense of, where do we think we might stand. But I think the underlying question that I want to sort of tease out of you is connected to what Vivek said, right? Is highly engaged board members. And therefore, what's the role of the non-profit leader? Uh, in ensuring a highly engaged board, right? What is it that nonprofit leaders who are able to engage their boards well or leverage their boards well differently from those who might not be able to do so?
Okay. Thank you very much. Vivek, it was like you were sitting inside my head. You took away all my points. Okay. But I'm going to try and, make a few additional comments. So, Pakistan, if I were to, over 15 years that I've worked with multiple organizations at various levels that, the founder or the CEO has come to me to say, hey, help with our board, I would overall rate our, sector at maybe 4 or 5 on 10. And honestly, I'm being generous. And that's really because I think that we haven't yet made the distinction between effective individual board members and effective boards, right? And I think they're two very different things. I think individual people, of course, many organizations will claim to have wonderful experiences with individual people, but far fewer will be able to say that as a board, this board has pulled its weight, right? So I think it's very important to make that distinction. I think that, really relates to a great extent, and I'm drawing from what Irina said earlier as well, which is establishing the will of the founder or the CEO to want to make a change at the board level, right? And I think that's critical. I mean, personally, I will never take it at face value when somebody says, help with our board and I want to make a difference, right? How do we establish that will of the founder to be governed or the CEO to be governed? And again, I think we need to make a distinction between a founder and a CEO, but, just for today, let's assume that they're one and the same. I think that the will of the leader to be governed needs to be established. And honestly, there's an extremely simple test that I use. How quickly are they getting back to me on suggestions? And how quickly are they taking actions on suggestions being made? If it is critical, then I would say within 24 to 48 hours. If it's not critical, then I would really encourage the leaders to sit down, reflect, and look at the board related stuff only when it is really important. And the reason I say this is because as a culture, we are not a transactional culture. We are a very relationship-y culture, right? So if we sort of take the approach of saying, hey, I want this board member to do this, then it's a transaction. I mean, once that gets done, you've lost the person, right? We are naturally a relationship-driven people. So how do we invest in building those relationships over a period of time? And this is to Vivek's point on engagement. The truth is that there are only some people who will engage well. It's, I think, hugely to do with priorities and personality, right? I mean, honestly, I'm a huge fan of typing people on personalities. The jury is out there, but I think there's some merit in sort of understanding who within this ecosystem of the organization will be a good board member engager or a board engager, and not burdening a person to whom this isn't natural to do that role, right? Because then you've sort of just, you're more interacting more on what needs to get done. I think it's very important, although, to start out by saying, what do I need the board to do? To one of Vivek's earlier points about how one can think about their boards and what is the work that needs to get done. I think as a sector, almost anybody that I've come across will always start by saying, who do I want on the board? Okay. To me, that is step 18, right? It's not even step 1 or 2. So it is, what do I want the board to do today? Why? What are the resources that I'm willing to invest in ensuring that the board is able to do what I want them to do? So really establishing clarity of roles and expectations and being as detailed as is possible, right? To even say that, okay, I will draw out the agenda for the year. And this is what I need to get done at the end of the year. This is what I will expect the board and the board members to do. This is how it could get done. So, task forces, working groups, etc., and doing all that background work and homework, I think is critical to enabling a board to do its job well. I'm also a great fan of what I call the board plan. Honestly, it's in my head. I don't think any organization that I have come across has a board plan, but I think it'll be wonderful if a board sat down and said, this is our plan for the year, and this is in alignment with the strategic plan of the organization. So if the organization's strategic goals are 1, 2, 3, as a board, this is how we will support the founder or the CEO in delivering on that, right? And I think for a board to sit down together and draw out a plan is a useful way to even get the board members to think about how much time they're willing to invest or not invest. Right. I think the last point, or one of the other points I want to make, is really being very clear and persistent in asking for help. Okay. I think there is a lot of assumption that CEOs or founders make. They sort of expect that board members will, respond or behave. But I do know that if we go out there and very specifically ask individual people or the board for help in certain ways, and that can change from time to time, I think that the responses that we will get will be far different, and there will be lesser, frustration. Also, I think letting go of non-performers. I mean, all too often I've had individuals on both sides. They say they don't know how to get off, and that brings me back to the cultural part. And you don't want people to feel bad. You're going to meet them at a wedding, you're going to meet them on the golf course, and how do I then? It's awkward, it's embarrassing, so on and so forth. But I would say give a person a max of a year to see if she or he is able to contribute. And if not, move them to friends of the organization, advisors, council of elders, whatever that might be. Because that's still a way for them to stay connected, but you're lowering the burden, so to speak, on both the engagement and the ability or willingness to contribute. The last point I want to make is I think a lot of CEOs suffer almost with what I call the inherited board. So they inherit the board that the founder has set up. It's not really a board that she or he has set up. And they're trying to really, navigate those relationships. So I think allowing for professional CEOs to invite people who they would like to get onto the board based on, again, what their own expectations are, and based on what needs to get done. I think will make it a lot easier for good governance to sort of happen. And I'm a great fan of, obviously having a lot of structures and processes in place at the level of detail that, some might find an overkill, but I think it helps to say, this is what we'll get done. This is what we expect of individual board members, having conversations periodically with individual board members and so on. And that should be based on, honestly, why is X or Y on the board in the first place, right? I mean, the conversation is always from the CEO's lens or the founder's lens. It's very rarely from the lens of why has X signed on? What are their motivations? What are their constraints? What are they trying to get out of this whole engagement or experience, right? That then feeds into the engagement really easily, right? I don't know if there are many organizations that will sit down one-on-one and say, thank you so much for agreeing, or, even before that, to say, what would you like to gain out of this experience? Is it other people, networks with other people? Is it being part of a mission, a cause? Look, some people, I think, will come in because of the competencies they have. Some people are likely to come in because they feel passionately about a cause. And I think it's important to sort of have a good mix of both, right? And lastly, I think very important for the board to reflect on its own performance every year. Just sit around the table and say, how did we do? And what were the gaps and what did we really do well? And celebrating what got done well. I mean, very, very few. I look around, look at websites of organizations, and I look at LinkedIn profiles of board members. I don't find every board member saying that they are board members of those organizations or talking about the organization in public domain. I mean, can we not have interviews by board members that are shared on the YouTube and digital media links of various organizations? Can we get board members to send out annual reports or to everybody that they know? So there are a bunch of things like that that I think the board can also do. Of course, it will mean that they need to be supported, which means that organizations and people who work there will need to invest some time. But it takes two to tango. That's all I'm saying.
Lovely, Aarti. Thank you so much for that. I think you've gone from giving us a really sort of broad perspective down to what can board members do and how can one really sort of engage and leverage them. What I've especially sort of liked through all of these conversations in the past sort of 1 hour is us touching upon some of the more sensitive issues, right? Which is around inheriting a board. What do I do when I've inherited a board and perhaps I don't feel this is necessarily the right fit? Earlier we spoke about sort of big egos and small organizations, right? The nonprofit is small, purpose-driven, energetic. Are we bringing on too many sort of huge personalities with bigger egos onto the table? How do we set expectations, right, with board members? And like you're saying, Aarti, wondering whether we really take the time and the effort to look at it from sort of a perspective of what is it that the board member wants out of this? How can we sort of leverage their skills, their networks, and everything else, thought leadership, for the cause of the organization? How do we I think this has come up now thrice across the past hour, how do we let non-performers go? And these are sort of awkward conversations. These are not always sort of spoken about. Non-profit leaders don't often find themselves supported to make some of these decisions or to be able to sort of think through these decisions. Before I sort of open it up to questions, and I know there are a lot of them, any sort of thoughts, Ravi, Irina, Vivek, Peter, that you would like to bring in before we open it up? All right. So with that, I think I'm going to go first to Vanessa. Just a quick thing out there. We would like this to be conversation, so I'm not going to be asking the questions. We would really like the audience to be interacting and asking questions. If I can request the tech team to please pin the person who is talking, and I will call out your name. Please unmute yourself, and the tech team will make sure that they have your video on as well and that they pin you up. Can we please have Vanessa from Sneha ask her question? Vanessa, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. I'm there, Pakistan. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I think these were really, really insightful inputs for all of us. I'd like to actually talk about and ask a question about board rotation. You know, we all know that we need to move members of a board, but is there, in your experience, typically an ideal period for a board member to stay on the board to effectively contribute? Or is it not about time and just about engagement? In that case, what does the CEO have to do to engage members over a period of time?
Does anybody say?
Do you want to? You can just leap in, sweetheart. Just unmute
Pakistan, can I say something?
Please, Peter, go ahead.
I talked earlier about the context of Atlantic. The board, when I became chairman, had 18 members, and that got cut back to 8 by having term limits and by rotating people out. It was preceded by, if you like, an evaluation process where we all talked to each other about each other, and we had a consultant that helped us do that. So to make the board more effective, then I think rotation definitely. Sometimes when you have fixed terms, you've got a director who's still incredibly effective, otherwise sometimes not. So almost having like an option to rotate at a point in time and to decide whether to extend the term or not, I think gives you the flexibility that you need. But the appraisal system, where all of the directors talk about each other through an independent person and gets feedback on a regular basis, you're improving the productivity of the board and the individual performance of the board. That's the way it would happen in most industries. In philanthropy, there's almost an a low expectation of non-execs, board members. And sometimes people say, well, they don't get paid. You know, why should you have a high expectation? If you don't have a high expectation, why would you want them there in the first place?
Ravi and then Aarti.
Yeah, I think I very much agree with Peter that you need to have term limits. And and that can be a check-in point where you can extend by mutual agreement for another term or not. But I want to go back to this idea of really thinking through whether you should separate your statutory board from an advisory board. See, I think with the laws in India and the consequences and the lack of judicial recourse and all that, I am very wary of joining a statutory board because, you know, you never know what can happen. And a lot of really good people are also similarly concerned. On the other hand, when you're an advisory board, there's less of this fiduciary responsibility, and you can just contribute in all the right and other ways. And so, I think I really want people to think hard about this and come to their own conclusion. So, and on advisory boards, we said, it's a 1-year renewable term, and we can keep renewing as long as both are interested. And that puts onus on you as well to make it worthwhile for them to want to stay on and serve yet another year. So, but the idea of term limits is one that I strongly endorse. Thank you, Peter.
Aarti? You're on mute, Aarti. The tech team, can we please unmute her?
Okay, yeah. I have a slightly different view on this. I think to have a rotation policy, because it's good to have it. I don't think is reason enough. I think that the decisions should really be based on if that individual has sort of outlived their usefulness or contribution to the organization. I mean, we do know of examples where the board has remained constant and continued to contribute to the organization in the manner that is sought by the CEO or the founder. But having said that, I think one useful reason to think about rotation is simply to widen the circle. The other issue, I think, in the nonprofit sector, and I don't want to generalize, but let's say in a specific category, is that it is very incestuous. I mean, you will have the same handful of 100 or 200 or 300 or 500 people who are sitting on multiple boards. And that's not good for the sector, because we do need a wider range of people to be involved and engaging with the sector. And I'm completely with Ravi in saying that there is no need for these people to be on the legal board. It is anyway just harder now than ever before. But can we have a robust advisory group? And I prefer to call it an advisory group or council and not an advisory board, because that sort of, has people sort of assume certain connotations when there shouldn't be any. But I think rotation for the sake of rotation is no. I think it really needs to be based on the usefulness of the individual, or what is expected from that person. And if she or he is able to fulfill that over a longer period of time, then great. But I think being mindful of really expanding the base of individuals who are, involved in the sector.
All right. Sorry, did someone want to say something? Okay. Moving on, Dhruv, if we can have your question around the role of the founder and therefore their role in figuring a chairperson.
Okay, my question was that, let's assume there's a startup founder and builds an organization and is a CEO. Now, from an ideal point of view, or is it purely circumstantial, should this startup founder, as the organization grows, where he has been the CEO, one day become the chairperson of the board? Because, obviously, you're looking for a certain degree of independence and autonomy in the chairperson. So how would it all work out? And the second question is that if that person chooses to not become the chairperson, but remain a CEO, then what role should that CEO have in choosing the chairperson, or even on being on the board? So these are my two questions, and I had originally addressed these to Vivek.
These are very, very good questions. Joe, thank you for that. Let me say that, having worked with a number of founders over time, this question of, letting go, or this question of when they feel that these institutions at some level in their early stages exist to express their own desire to impact society, they express their own purpose. And at some point in the institution's journey, the founder realizes that the ability to maintain a certain level of control and have the institution express their own interest or express their own purpose will at some point in time come into conflict with the institution's ability to fulfill its mission at some degree of scale, or some degree, and this is not always the case, but in many cases you end up with that conflict, right? And I think it becomes somewhat incumbent upon the founder to have someone, it could be in the form of a chairperson, could be in the form of a private counselor, to recognize when that's happening. And so my first answer to your question is, at that point in time when the founder becomes partly a limiting force, even though they may be a highly energetic force, but maybe a limiting force for the institution and its growth, is something that it's very difficult for a founder for themselves to self-reflect on. They need to be surrounded by people who will point that out. And by the way, those people are in very short supply. I've had this conversation with a few people, and at times those conversations, when you're invited into them, go very well. When you're not invited into them, they go very badly. As it turns out, it's even though everyone sees it, it's tough to call it out. So that's the first thing I would say. The second is a more technical question, which is the role of the founder and the CEO or CEO in the selection of the chair. I do believe the selection of the chair is about holding culture together. It's about holding a level of expectation of the board together. And I do think that that is something. I wouldn't see that as a lack of independence. I would see it as a good chair knows that their objective is to be independent, is to take input from the founder, but they also know that their role isn't there to just serve the founder. They know their role is there to serve the institution. And as both Ravi and Arina said, your objective isn't to serve the CEO or the founder. Your objective is to serve the mission and purpose. So if you find that that is coming into conflict, then it's obviously a conversation that should be had about whether you have the right chair or whether you have a founder who's truly willing to take a board on for all the glory of its independence and what it can deliver.
Could I try Pakistan?
Yes, please. Peter, and then Irina, I would like you to come in as well, please.
I must admit, from the experiences I've had where the CEO becomes the chairman, it doesn't have a high success rate unless you're completely convinced that everything is great. Then you don't want to move the CEO to the chairman. The CEO debating a decision that he took a year previously, which he thinks was good and other people think was bad. So it inhibits change. I think it slows down the speed of reaction. I think your second part of your question about selecting the chair, I think it's the board that selects the chair. So even in Atlantic Philanthropies, and I didn't go on to tell you all the changes that were made post, if you like, Chuck Feeney's ideologies, but one of them, he thought he would choose the chair. If you like, the outcome that we eventually had was the board chose the chair. So empowering the board is important. If you're going to get a talented group of people, you need to give them the opportunity to express themselves and exert influence. But CEOs to chair, I'm not a fan. I've had very few positive experiences of it.
I have a slightly different perspective, Mr. Khaitan. One is, I think, when do founders move up? Founders, if they're self-aware, move up for three reasons. One is they just get tired. Second is the job becomes operational, and a lot of them are mission-driven or passion-driven, and it doesn't appeal to them anymore. Or third, they want to create mutual ownership with other people, and they feel till they are the only one, the accountability and the passion doesn't move to the broader team, and it's critical for them to step away. Now, all of this, of course, assumes, to Vivek's point, a degree of self-awareness and a degree of separation between who I am and what I do. If who I am is what I do, then all of this is unlikely to be known by the individual, right? But usually it's boredom, fatigue, or a reason to pass on the baton and make sure the institution outlives the individual. This transition from the first founder, who's usually larger than life, hugely inspirational, especially internally, to the first professional CEO is the most tricky moment, I think, in the growth of a nonprofit. And at that point in time, it depends on the kind of person you're hiring. There can be three roles for the first professional CEO. He could be a flame keeper. Everything remains the same. This is the Lakshman to the Ram or Bharat to the Ram, in which case the chairman is the old CEO. He could be an executor. He just scales up, in which case the founder becomes the chairman because there's no conflict. But if you're hiring a professional CEO to transform the organization, then the founder cannot become the chairman because he's going to challenge some of the fundamental assumptions that the nonprofit was built on. So I think whether the person becomes the chairman or not depends on what is the job to be done by the first professional CEO. Maintenance, growth, or transformation. If it's maintenance and growth, let the guy become the chairman. If it's transformation, he needs to walk.
Fabulous. I'm going to move on to Paula. And again, a super interesting point, Paula, that you bring up, which has been spoken about through the conversation in the past hour, is accountability of boards, right? And that everyone keeps CEOs accountable. What about board accountability? Please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Pakistan, and thanks all the panelists for a very, very enlightening and very engaging discussion. As NGO boards, we often struggle to define clearly our roles. And I really liked Ravi's approach of separating statutory from advisory. I think we inherently go as advisors and to be engaged. I think by definition, hopefully most people who get onto not-for-profit boards are there for purpose, to the way Vivek described purpose, and I really resonate with that. But in all this, and considering the composition is a mix of executives, of non-executives who bring in different experiences, I think I've struggled with figuring out how do we get a clarity on our own roles, collectively as a board and individually. And some of it can happen through task forces, as Ravi rightly pointed out. And I think that's a clean way of giving clear engagement and clear roles and responsibilities. But collectively as a board, how do we figure out whether we are effective, and to whom are we accountable? Are we, yes, broadly accountable to the mission or the vision or, that is driving the organization? But are we accountable to the founder or CEO, or at some point that changes? Are we there to enable the team to just deliver? Or are we supposed to really evaluate how our engagement is driving the organization? I find that a lot of boards, we have this conflicting view on what we're supposed to do. Are we accountable at all, or are we there to really look at the accountability of the executive people who are on the board, or to evaluate how the CEO is doing, how the founder, has he or she outlived the organization? So, if you could throw some light on just being more productive quantitatively as well as a board for an NGO.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So, Paula, thank you for that. My view is that the board needs to be accountable to the task or the role that it has taken on for itself. And that, that to me is the first step, right? So every year or 2 years, like I mentioned earlier, I think it's important for a board to sit down with the CEO perhaps, but also just amongst itself, right? To say, this is how we're going to function. And this is what we're going to bring to the table. And actually articulating that and getting to a point of agreement with the CEO or the founder. I think what falls off the crack is when there are assumptions being made on both sides, right? And then there's disappointment and frustration, and then the whole engagement also is very difficult. So I think a good way to do it would be to say, as a board, this is what we're going to do. Is this adding to the adding to the delivery of the mission, and is it supporting the founder or the CEO in executing what they want to do? And reflecting on it very, very consciously. I'm a great fan of saying boards need to self-reflect once in 2 years, or actually once a year. I mean, just like they would hold the CEO or the founder accountable for the mission that they're supposed to be working towards. I think that's important, and I think clarity comes really from having a very open conversation about what can I do, what can I bring to the table, and also what I do not want to do. Right? A lot of the time, I think there is an assumption that boards will behave in a certain way. Opening up of networks, right? I mean, it's an assumption that every board member will write to 40 people or connect with everybody she or he knows. But a specific board member may or may not be comfortable doing that. But having the clarity is important, and for the board member to feel comfortable enough to say that, look, I'm on X or Y boards, and I'm comfortable reaching out to these people. I'm not comfortable reaching out to the others, right? I think that conversation helps in building simpler ways to be accountable.
Thanks, Aarti.
Yes, Peter, please.
The point that Ravi makes about, which is a very good point, about getting a particular form of expertise into some sort of subgroup, I think is important. What we've tried to do is bring people into each board committee that might not be on the full board, but they're experts in their subject. So they bring a different dimension to board committees. What I don't like about the different boards for different functions is that the communication process becomes difficult. Integrating to create a holistic view when 4 groups have got slightly different agendas, you have a problem of bringing them back together again and integrating to get a view. So I'd much prefer board committees with outside advice. The point about who you're accountable to, the customer, the user, the beneficiary, if you like, absolutely is the focus. When you're judging impact, the impact of the board is you made a difference on the life of the vulnerable and the disadvantaged. Getting regular feedback from your implementing partners and from the people they serve is really important. So this annual evaluation process of how you deal with your key relationships, how annual appraisal of your people, annual appraisal of the board, I think all the time to continually test the effectiveness of the major functions that make up the organization is very important.
Thank you very much, Peter. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I know there are many questions on the chat, but we do need to close out now. In terms of closing out, we thought we'd do a quick rapid fire with our panelists in terms of, one thing that you think board members should start doing, stop doing. One thing that CEOs of NGOs should start doing or stop doing as it relates to better board engagement. And I'm going to start off with you, Ravi, move on to Vivek, and then Aarti and Peter.
Well, the one thing I would say for board members is to, introspect and say, is this a board you really want to be part of? And if you choose to be part of it, then to give it your best. Okay, there's no joy and value in being half committed, neither to the organization, nor to yourself. So it's binary. So that's what I would say.
Perfect. Vivek?
That's a good question. I'd say I'm actually exactly where Ravi is. I would say for board members, start to ask, what you're there and what you can contribute distinctively, and start to make that, have that conversation openly with the board, with the chair, with the founder, just so expectations get set. I think things that are left unsaid can sometimes be simmering issues. I think for CEOs, start expecting more. And for CEOs, stop thinking you're being managed. This is not about, a board is there to enable you, not to manage you. And so if it feels like you were doing a lot of paperwork or a lot of administrative work to keep a board up to date or happy, there's something you need to revisit, right, in your compact with the board. And finally, for board members, the one thing I'd say to stop doing is don't take on too many or take on boards that you're not, for whom you would not go the extra mile externally to represent. I think there's something in there around the purpose. Thank you.
Aarti?
Well, just adding to what Vivek and Ravi have said, I think I agree with what they need to stop doing, but I think what they need to continue doing or do more of is to play an ambassadorial role. You just cannot have enough of that, right? So, I mean, there should be no inhibition in every board member of every organization making it widely known that they are on the board of those organizations. And I think that's something that's critical in terms of just enabling greater confidence in clear communities of board members to want to become involved with organizations. I think for CEOs, they should simply stop indulging non-performing board members, and must find easier ways to let them go. And there are gracious ways of doing it, and happy to send some thoughts later to anybody that wants that. But I think that's really critical, because we set up creating poor standards if we have in a board some high performing individuals and a few that are just warming the chair. So I think it's important to be very, very clear that you want both the individuals and therefore the board as a group to perform better and better every year.
Thank you, Aarti. And lastly, Peter, parting thoughts.
I think it's about evaluation and feedback and being upfront. And I don't mean in any sense being aggressive. But I talk to different people and they ask questions. So a question I had yesterday was, what would you do if one of your board members refuses to take part in a 360-degree evaluation because this person says, I don't get paid, and now you want to judge me? In Atlantic, if you like, each year, everybody would get evaluated. Everybody would be given feedback. So the board gets evaluated. Each person will be interviewed to talk about the other people. And it's done quite openly, and its intent is to improve performance. We do surveys of our implementing partners to get feedback on what they think we could do better than we do. It's a process of self-improvement. So being upfront, it does take an attitude which is sort of like to confront the issue. And confront isn't in any sense aggressive, but it is to face up to something. And providing you're choosing the right issues to face up to, then you can improve performance. So whether it's feedback from customers, implementing partners, staff, associates, it's really encouraged.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And before I let everyone leave this absolutely fascinating learning lab, and totally acknowledging that there is much more to dive into more, and so we will have that session, but request you all to please fill in this poll, which is up on your screens right now. Would be fantastic to get feedback and to understand if we would like to be part of such sessions, and if that was helpful, and if we should dive deeper into this particular topic. Again, thank you very much, Ravi, Vivek, Aarti, Peter, Irina, who's not here, and everyone who joined us for this session. Extremely insightful. Please stay tuned for the rest of the sessions today and for tomorrow. And I will have thank you.
You did a great job, Roxanne. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye.
What do we do now?
Leave meeting. Leave meeting.
Peter, we can leave.
Thank you very much, Paksan. I needed your permission to go.
You absolutely have it, even though I don't want you to. Bye, Vivek.